the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I'm your host, Vin Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And co-hosting again with me today is Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. Hey, Pete.
Hey, Vin.
How you going, man?
Good. It's a absolutely beautiful day out here today. So we've lost all our snow. It's kind of spring. The birds are coming back. I'm in a good mood today.
It's spring?
Well, it sort of looks like spring.
It's heading to spring. Yeah.
It'll get there.
Yeah, well, it's 5 a.m. 5 a.m. here in Melbourne, and you know, we're coming out of summer, so it's, you know, it's
you're heading the other way.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. You know, we're not only at polar opposites of the globe, we're pretty much polar opposites of the weather. So, but enough about the weather. Today, we also have a special guest, and that is Noel Borthwick, who's the CTO of Cakewalk, who are a leading audio software developer that has a history that spans 30 plus years. And Noel's coming in from Massachusetts in the United States. Welcome, Noel.
Hey, Vin, Pete. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really glad to be here.
You're most welcome, man. You're most welcome. Now, just before we kick into your history and how you actually landed at Cakewalk, what I like to do with the guests, and again, it's following a bit of tradition for the show, is just to give a bit of an overview of our personal history and interaction, which, look, the last time we actually chatted was 2008, Noel, so that was, a good 13 years ago. And what that was in reference to was I was running into some curves with some multiprocessor performance issues within Sonar, and I'll just give everyone a bit of a background, just so we can actually put a place card on that conversation. So, if you go back to around 2005, 2006, where I started DAWbench, the initial test sessions were within Cubase and Nuendo, which I'll just call Cubendo from now on to make it easier. And they were based on a test session that Steinberg had supplied. Then I beefed it up with some sine waves, and then I developed that process where then, I'd be adding incrementally plugins to the session until it broke. So that was the whole process that I developed with Cubase. And things are moving very, very quickly within the Windows DAW arena, and Sonar were leading the pack when it came to developing for 64-bit. So I was on XP64. Steinberg had, what they refer to as a public beta for 64-bit. So I decided to move to Sonar to do some 64-bit testing. And the first benchmark that I did with Sonar, actually called Sonar Bench of all things, and I just remember. Yeah, and I followed the same procedure. There was a demo song that Cakewalk had provided. I beefed it up with the sine waves, and then selected an internal plugin from the Sonar plugin list, and I ran the test in 32-bit, got a reference, and then when I ran it in 64. It kind of collapsed on me, and I'm scratching my head going, well, what's going on here? And I kind of reached out to some of the guys in the community, and we'd figured out that I had inadvertently selected one of the internal plugins that hadn't been ported to 64-bit now. So
bit bridge.
Yeah, so the bit bridge was just slamming it, and then, we quickly resolved that. And then, once that was resolved, the performance between the 32-bit and the 64-bit was very, very similar. Now, the 32-bit program was actually running in XP64, so it's under that WASABI layer, but it was working fine. So, performance, whether it was a 32-bit running in 64-bit OS or 64-bit, was very, very similar. So I was happy with that. And if we fast forward a couple of years, when I developed the DAWbench universal reference sessions, that's when I started doing some performance comparative stuff between the actual available DAWs. And what reared its head then was so we were moving from dual core to quad core and then dual quad core. And as the core count was rising, we were starting to kind of encounter some issues at the low latencies. And one thing that kind of stuck out was on that version of Sonar, which was, I think, 7 at the time, on the 8-core machine, there was a very pronounced spiked core, only at the extreme lower latencies. And we were running RME and Lynx cards, so we were talking only, probably under 2 millisecond type of playback. But there was a very, very pronounced core. And, I presented that, and there was a lot of discussion. And then I got CC'd into an email thread with you and Keith, with one of the higher end users that was also encountering this problem. Can you remember anything or much about that, Noel?
I do. Yeah, it's a different era.
Yeah, it definitely was. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much has changed since then, but I definitely remember the scenario. And I believe when you get into multi-core applications, right? Highly, do you recall how many cores you were running at the time?
It was 8. There was 8. There was no hyper-threading on those machines, so it was 8 physical cores, but across two CPUs. So there would have been some arbitration between the two cores, and the arbitration between the two CPUs. Sorry, not the cores. Yeah,
got it. So the issue with general multi-threading, right, and multi-processing, when you start getting into the low latency domain, is you're processing really tiny buffers. So while we do that so that we and when you're doing multi-core processing, we are typically partitioning the work out among your cores. So in your case, if you had 8 cores, we'd have 8 worker threads, delegating work and trying to partition the work across these different cores and threads. When you start getting into the low latency domain, it starts getting really busy because there's a lot of context switching going on for buffer processing, because the Azure driver or your whatever driver you're using is requesting buffers, and for every buffer that's getting into the engine, we're partitioning the work across all your cores, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of context switching going on for your processor, and also when you're processing at really tiny buffer sizes, your CPU load actually increases. So that's where kind of the advantage of multi-core processing does come in, but there's also the fixed performance cost for multiprocessing.
Yeah. Well,
so I'm just trying to give you some context of why workloads are, why you get cores are busier when you're running at lower latencies and you're doing multiprocessing.
Yeah, no, sure. And we can cover that in far more detail a bit later, which we will. But the point that I was making was that there was one very pronounced core.
Yes.
And it wasn't actually being shown on the task manager. There was a spiked core in the task manager, but not as much. This was just representative within the performance meter of Sonar itself.
So I think part of that is it's faulty measurement for one.
Yeah.
It's which we've corrected over the years. It's the way we measured performance in the application is we're measuring the quantum of work done as compared to the time it's supposed to take to finish that work, which is your latency, right? Whatever your buffer size is.
Yes.
So, and there were some issues, I believe, in the way we were computing some of that. So that might have accounted for why Cakewalk was internally showing one of the cores spiked, as opposed to Task Manager showing that.
Yep.
But in addition to that, there's also, the way we process data is we have one thread which is doing all the work of, producing the data to be farmed out across the different cores.
Right.
So that's kind of like a fixed workload. So it's not completely abnormal to see one core working a little more than other cores.
Yep. And look, and I do see that across other DAWs as well. The only reason that I bring this point up is that it was visually a lot higher, but it was more than a visual representation, because if that single core clipped, the playback engine stopped. So it was more than just a visual representation. Look, we can cover that a little bit more later, because I know that you have done a stack of work with multiprocessing and core balancing and load balancing within the later versions of Cakewalk. So let's put a pin in that now, because what I want to do is, I think we should I think it'd be interesting for the listeners to hear from you some personal history, not only how you actually landed at Cakewalk, but also your personal history away from Cakewalk, your interests, and how you got yourself into music technology and how you actually eventually landed at Cakewalk. I think that'd be great.
Sure. I'll proceed to bore you with the details. So yeah, I mean, I actually started out like most kids, it's like in school, I got interested in music. I got interested in rock and roll, and later on, I got into fusion. And I'm a guitar player, so I kind of developed a deep interest in jazz, like as I got to a teenager, and I kind of started getting more into like prog rock and fusion, and then into like more mainstream jazz, like bebop and stuff like that. And that kind of drove most of my interests in later life, even when I started getting into computing. In my late teenage years, I thought at one point I was going to be a musician. So I even after school, I was actively like trying to like take up a career in music for some time. It's all like for almost a year until I realized that this was not going to be any kind of viable monetary source of income. Right. So I switched back, probably for a good reason. I went back to college. I finished my college. I studied physics and mathematics. I didn't study music in college, but I continued, playing and performing to some extent music all through my college years. And I kind of finished up with physics and maths. And when I actually started looking around to find jobs, I found like that the only options I had available to me were like to either get into academics or to get into further studies, neither of which was very attractive to me.
Right.
So that's when I kind of I started studying computers. I did go into further studies with computers. I studied computer science, and that's what I found that clicked with me. It was really interesting to me, and I found it creative, and still nothing to do with music yet. Because most of the work being done at that time was all either scientific work or just pure business software. So which was my first gig,
right?
Really.
And just to put a timestamp, what year was that, Noel?
That's probably like around 83, 84.
Okay, that's like really early in the computing era. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So computers, like I didn't even own a PC at that point of time. It's like they were all like workstation based stuff, and I happened to like get into this company which was doing pretty interesting work for the time. It's like it was CPM. I think they called it concurrent CPM, and they were like kind of multi-user workstation based things. But what was unique was the company actually had a modified version of CPM in their arsenal. So that's what was kind of cool to work at a company which was actually building the operating system and actually writing the software for that as well.
Right. And so what kind of software was it again, Noel?
All primarily like business-oriented software. I mean, like we did have a team that was actually working on the operating system, but I was more in like the application side of the fence. So just building our, business type applications.
On CPM, huh?
On CPM, correct.
Yeah. So was it like COBOL or something like that?
Yeah, believe it or not, like most of even though I studied, some of the scientific programming things like Fortran and stuff, most of the work was in COBOL at the time.
Exciting.
Very exciting indeed. And so a little nugget of information. So that's about the first time I got interested in my spare time at the company. I would hang around like after work and try and do some research into like music stuff. It's like and I wrote this program to actually do an analysis of scale theory. And I wrote it in COBOL of all languages because it was the only compiler available to me at the time.
That's some dedication, Noel.
Yeah, but it was cool because it really doesn't matter what you write it in.
Your app was cool, but the COBOL stuff was not cool.
Yeah, definitely not. But so it took. I remember working out like cyclic permutations of scales and modes, which I was studying like modal theory at the time, and it took like a good 18 hours or something like that to just figure out the results of those computations. That's something that I bet if I wrote that code today, it would probably run in like 30 seconds. It just gives you an idea of the order of magnitude of like how computing has gone.
Yeah,
it's impressive that you kind of bent the language to be able to do that, because folks today are used to modern languages that you can pretty much do anything in, but COBOL really was designed to do business applications stuff, and that's it.
Yeah, the data structures were kind of rough because you could do you couldn't quite do recursion and things like that in COBOL. It was all very procedural, right? So I had to code all this stuff very procedurally and use like really old-fashioned data structures.
So that's cool. So this analysis of the scales, like what came of that?
Yeah, so I did an analysis of like all the classic scale groups, which is like 8-tone scales, 7-tone scales, 6-tone scales, pentatonic scales, and it was great because the books at the time when I was looking around, were kind of boring. It's like all books did was like they'd give you a scale or a mode and then transpose it into all 12 keys. Who cares about that? It's like you want to understand, the intervallic relationships of the scales. At least that's what was exciting to me. So this allowed me to kind of boil down all this information into like, really very easy to understand format. It's like in the 7-tone scales, you just get a tiny handful of, I think there are about 6 scales that you end up getting. That's it. There's nothing more than that to study. So it kind of gives you a reality check on what you need to do. Nice. And same with pentatonic scales. It's like I actually have like what do they call those? Printouts, right? You get those sheets. I forget what they call them, but I still have stacks of those sheets with all that stuff printed out somewhere.
And it might sound obvious today, but back then it had to have been kind of a bit of an eye-opening experience for you.
Absolutely, yeah. And I still use that information. To date. You can find all of this in books today, but I still have the original stuff that I did 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, well, definitely ahead of its time. Were you talking about like the circle of fifths stuff that the books are representing, or something different again?
It's like you guys know what modes are, right? It's like on a major scale, you get 7 modes, right? Yeah. And modes are basically just cyclic permutations of the same scale.
Yeah, yeah.
So this kind of worked backwards and like figured out all the possible scales that are generated out of 12 tones. It's like in music theory, you have 12 tones, at least in Western music.
Yeah.
So if you ask the question, it's like, I want all 7-tone scales. What are the constraints for building these 7-tone scales? Yep. It's like you put in the constraints and then you just iteratively compute all that stuff from there. I mean, there are plenty of people who did this research, but this knowledge was not like openly available in textbooks at the time. I think Nicholas Slonimsky did a ton of stuff. I don't know if he used computing to do it, but he has a book on, patterns that he generated, pretty exhaustive study on.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't overly common in rock music, but in jazz fusion and progressive, they were definitely experimenting more with the modal stuff. So, yeah, very, very interesting. So, let's continue your journey.
I mean, a few little stepping stones. From there, I got extremely bored doing, application software for business stuff. And I was fortunate enough to hook up with a company doing computer graphics, which was much more interesting to me. And I started doing like stuff for 3D graphics, animation. I worked with that company for about 4 years, and I even started my own company with a partner doing 3D animation stuff for like film and things like that for a couple of years.
Right.
Was that still in the 80s, Noel? Or
that was probably late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, so you've been kind of on the front edge of a number of these things then.
Yeah, you could say that. At least when I got into computer graphics, it's like that was like very early. I started doing that in 87. That was like really early computer graphics. In fact, the first software that I worked on there, it was command line based, believe it or not. It's like there was some GUI, but to actually render 3D objects, you had to like type commands into a command prompt to actually extrude shapes and do all kinds of operations on them. Yeah. It's kind of unheard of today. But it was fun. And then towards the end of that period, I ended up getting a call from this famous company called Corel, which did they did 2D graphics. So I kind of moved from 3D graphics. I moved down a dimension into 2D graphics, and I got a gig with them. I worked with them for about 4 years. I worked on pretty much Corel Draw version 6. Till 8, I believe.
Yeah.
I worked on about 3 or 4 versions of that.
Now, were they're precursors to Adobe by a few years, or was Adobe floating around at the same time? Because I remember
around the same time. They were, pretty heavy competitors. There was Photoshop was around. Corel had Photo Paint.
Yep.
But Corel Draw for a while was like kind of the market leader with at least. I'm trying to remember if they had a Mac version at the time. They were like very Windows centric and kind of in a sense like a little bit like Cakewalk. They were on the bleeding edge of Windows, doing a lot of really deep stuff with Ole and embedding of objects and all of that.
I was a big Corel Draw user back then, so and I remember you go to the store, you wouldn't see Photoshop on the shelf, but you would see Corel Draw on the shelf. Back when software was sold on shelves.
But Corel Draw would be more a competitor to Illustrator, wouldn't it? Than Photoshop.
I think it did everything, if I recall.
It's 2D graphics, kind of like Illustrator, But they had a whole suite.
It was vector based.
Yes.
So that's more Illustrator, Pete. Where Photoshop is more pixel based.
Right, but they also had they had Photo Paint, right? So Corel was probably the first really big. My first introduction to like developing stuff for retail software, right? They were a retail software company. It's like, the classic model. It's like you release a new version every year. And the teams were kind of structured to do that too. We had a team which worked on Photo Paint, which was like the paint program. I worked in the 2D graphics program, and they had all kinds of interesting stuff going on.
And they sold it all as a suite at one point, because I think that's what I was getting at that time.
I think now it's called the graphics suite. They're still around. They're a lot smaller than at the peak when I was there. They acquired a company called WordPerfect. At the peak, I think we were like about 2,000 or 3,000 employees. It was Pretty
Wow.
big company.
Okay.
Yeah. But I may have been using code you wrote, which I find to be super cool. So
There you go.
Yeah, so at the end of that period, it's like I kind of burnt out on graphics. I'd been doing that for a while, and I mean, graphics is fun, but I never really connected to it because, I mean, I was always interested in the music side at a very deep level, and I continued, my pursuit of music. Even before I got into like programming and like working at Cakewalk, I was a user first, like all you guys, I started out with a program called Mastertracks Pro, actually.
Yeah.
And that was my first sequencer.
that's mine as well.
Oh, you too?
Yeah, so I used it on Commodore 128. It came with a Passport MIDI interface.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I did not. I had a Commodore 64, but I never really went there because that thing scared me. It just it would like crash and lose data, and it's like I'd spend hours or days doing stuff on it, and I'd go back the next day and your floppy drive is corrupt. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fun and games. Yeah.
But yeah, so I started with Mastertracks Pro, and I was reading an article in Keyboard magazine years ago, and I saw this review of Cakewalk, this program called Cakewalk, and Cubase side by side. And I read both the reviews, and they were both very exciting to me. It's like I almost bought Cubase because Cubase had this thing called Cubase Score, and I said, "Oh wow, that'll be great! I could put in all my scores into that and do it." But then Cakewalk had this thing called Cal, which was a scripting language, which allows you to, it was very rudimentary. It's like a Lisp-based language, which you can just string together early scripting operations, just pure MIDI stuff. But it was super cool to me because I wanted to learn a little bit about MIDI programming. So I ended up buying Cakewalk, and that was my first entry into Cakewalk. And so when I actually moved to Corel and I moved to North America, I was in Canada at the time. I contacted Cakewalk, and I ended up becoming a beta tester with them. This was way back in probably 93, 93 or so. And I just, I was writing all these Cal scripts and, communicating with the developers and stuff. And it so happened that I wrote to the founder of the company. I think it was Greg Hendershot. And I said, "Hey, I'm interested in joining your company. I think I have this background in graphics, and I obviously have a musical background. Let me know if you guys have an opening turnout." And I ended up getting an opening there.
Nice.
And I moved to start working with Cakewalk. That was back in 97.
Wow. So okay. So so you've been with Cakewalk now for 20. This will be your 24th year.
Yep.
Wow.
It's a long time.
You get less for murder, Noel.
I'm not sure it's a good thing, but it is what it is.
No, it is. That's brilliant that you've been at a company and still energized 24 years later. That's a testament in itself. That's brilliant. So what was some of the first stuff that you did with Cakewalk? So let's move into the Cakewalk and the versions, because the company itself, like I said in the intro, that's 30 plus year of history.
More than 30 years, yeah,
which is quite amazing. So can you give us some insight on what you were working on at Cakewalk itself, and maybe just give us a bit of a rundown of some of the versions? Because I remember there was, before Sonar, there was, you had your Cakewalk, and I'm trying to remember where it actually transitioned into Cakewalk Pro Audio. It was around version 5, I think, somewhere around there. And then we moved up to, I think, up to about Sonar 8, and then it went to, I'm trying to remember where the transition was from Pro Audio and then to Sonar, and then how many versions of Sonar, and then it went to an X, then the X series. So can you give us a bit of an overview of those? Thanks.
Yeah. So by the time I started, like Cakewalk had been around already for some time, probably close to 8 years or 9 years. Cakewalk started out as a DOS program, Cakewalk for DOS.
Right.
I didn't use any of the DOS versions because I jumped in version 1 of Windows, which came out I believe in 92. That was the very first version that ran on Windows 3.1. But yeah, there was Cakewalk for DOS, and I probably about 4 versions of that. And then they came out with the first Windows version in 92. I think it was called Cakewalk Professional for Windows.
Right.
And that was a pure MIDI sequencer. I don't think there were any audio sequencers at that time yet.
No, a little bit early, unless there was some preliminary stuff on early Macs and Atari Falcon, but I'm trying to timestamp that. That would have probably been 92, 93, somewhere around there. But nothing on Windows that I knew of. No.
So the first, if I remember right, the first version of Cakewalk that actually did audio was version 3, I believe, of the Windows version, or version 4, which was probably around 94. I was in the very first beta when it all started.
Yeah.
It was crazy. It's like the very first version, I think it played audio using MCI. I don't even know if you guys will, Pete will know what MCI is, but it played audio events using MCI. Really, it could play like one audio event or something like that. And then in around 94, 95, it actually became a real audio sequencer. It's like they hired Ron Cooper, who wrote the very first audio engine for Cakewalk. And it was kind of cool. I mean, it's like the audio engine was kind of built as like an add-on to the sequencer. And, it just shared the common clock. So it's like Cakewalk's roots were in MIDI, and it still is after all these years.
Yep.
And the original clock that drove everything was MIDI, right? But when audio came in, they kind of flipped it around, and like audio became the master clock, which then drove MIDI. But it was kind of designed in a way. It's very interesting. It's like the audio engine was literally designed as an add-on. It was like a DLL. It was a dynamic link library, which was running as part of the app. And for the longest time, it isn't that way anymore, but it was a DLL. And I think what was kind of forward-thinking back then was that, like, driver support, right? There was no, real pro audio Windows driver support back in 94 and 95. So there were we kind of wrote custom DLLs, kind of like in the old days where people had printer drivers, right? It's like before, it's like we had custom DLLs. We had one for DigiDesigns. They had this thing called Session 8, and
yes.
There were a few other audio interfaces which were in the space for pro audio, right? So we would write these custom plugin DLLs that not plugins as in VST plugins, but they were like DLLs that spoke to the hardware, and then the application itself spoke the same language, same API to these DLLs, and that's how we kind of implemented it back then.
It's like the early word processors where, it came with 5 more disks just full of printer drivers for
exactly. Predates Windows having its own model, right? Where everybody could use that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ASIO, I'm trying to think, ASIO was
much later,
getting towards the end of the 90s from memory. Yeah.
So we only adopted ASIO like much later. Like I think that was probably late 90s.
Yeah,
I think.
it was late 90s before.
Because for the longest time, it's like we were, we had this model where we had this DLL model, and then later on we started getting, when Windows kind of matured and started doing more stuff, we were very actively involved in that effort. I'll get into that a little bit. But yeah, you asked me earlier what was the first version I worked on, which was version 7. And the very first thing I did for Cakewalk was I actually wrote the first video engine for Cakewalk. That was my first gig, actually.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Cakewalk had no video support, and I had a background in graphics and all of that. So very pioneering. We were the first company to write a full engine based on DirectShow. So the video engine, actually, to date, parts of it are in DirectShow. So I did the whole framework for the video engine in DirectShow, and that kind of plugged into the same pluggable model that we had in Cakewalk. And we were slaving the video to the audio clock, just like we were slaving MIDI to the audio clock.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
So it was pretty interesting.
Is that still in there, or has that been?
That's still in there. I mean, the guts of that are still in there, believe it or not. But I'd be the first to say our video support isn't that great. I mean, we've got a long way to go to make things fluid. But the plumbing is there, and in several years later, we kind of replaced that with Media Foundation, which is the more modern framework in Windows for doing video.
Yeah.
But it's still the same, the same layer. The transport layer is still the same that communicates with all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say that video playback in any of the Windows DAWs has always been a challenge. So you can fill in the blank, and it's because there was never really any consensus on format and codec. So everyone moved to QuickTime there for a while, and there's still people using the QuickTime. But then Apple decided to throw the baby out with the bathwater with QuickTime, and that threw all of the developers into a bit of a spin to find some other solutions. But I can say quite confidently, Noel, that there's all of them. All of those DAWs are still having a challenge with video playback, and it comes down to using very particular codecs. And the choice of codec with the video playback can go from a complete choppy mess into something that is usable. And so, because I've got quite a few clients that are working in that space, the film and TV, and they're still grumbling to me about video support in any of the DAWs. Yeah,
it's surprisingly complex, and I think a lot of customers don't appreciate, the challenges there are for, like, audio is a real-time streaming thing, and video is highly dependent on buffering and, pre-processing and post-processing. So keeping things in sync and keeping stable audio while playing video is it's very challenging.
Yeah. Look, I mean, some of the stuff that I hear, look, it's one frame out, and you're thinking, so what? Yeah, well, mate, having the video one frame out when you're sending, you're comping and sending spots to the producers is catastrophic for these people. So it is quite a challenge. And again, it's quite a regular conversation that I have with a few of my close clients. And it's just an ongoing thing, Noel. So it is an interesting thing. And part of it was that whole QuickTime thing, and then having to transition from it. But I'm still finding that clients are still using that as a container to get the smoothest playback in Windows, which is kind of odd to me, but that's what they're still using. Sorry, I kind of broke your flow there.
Do you want me to tell you more about the other versions of Cakewalk?
Yes, please.
So where were we at? So when I started, it was like version 6. Version 7 was the first version that had video. And I also worked on the first rewrite of the audio engine, which was in pretty much around 2007 or so. We started moving away from, that whole concept of like using DLLs that I talked about earlier and writing specific things for each audio device because that's not sustainable, right? As there are more devices coming out, how do you support them? So we kind of switched to probably not wasn't a great idea, but we moved our audio engine to DirectX model, a direct show model more precisely. And again, direct show is like kind of very old now, so I don't know how much you remember about how it worked, but it's like it's a streaming system which is like, you string together a bunch of filters and you write renderers and you write sources and things like that. So we built our whole engine using that framework, and all our mixer objects and everything were built into that framework. And that was version 7, version 8, and version 9 were all kind of built using the DirectX framework. And we kind of realized towards the end of that, I mean, it was nice because that's around the time where we started doing DirectX plugins, right? That's where Cakewalk's roots come from. The only plugin technology available at the time was to build DirectX plugins. And we kind of pioneered the whole DirectX XDK, right? That was Cakewalk's baby.
Okay.
Back in the late 90s. So we had DirectX plugins. We kind of had a MIDI framework called MFX plugins.
Yes.
Again, built on the same. And, there are hosts today that still support that. Cakewalk still supports DirectX plugins. And I believe there are other hosts too. I know Reaper supports it. And
are they still around though? I would have thought, VST kind of
nobody's writing DirectX plugins anymore. There are just legacy things. I mean, we don't actively support it. We just maintain support for what exists in the field.
So Cakewalk will still run old DX plugins.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Only 64-bit though, because now there's no bridging for 32 to 64 DirectX. So
yeah.
So yeah, the while all that was cool, the downside with DX, right, is it wasn't really built to be a fluid platform which was designed for DAWs, right? It was designed more like for like video streaming and things like that, where things are not fluid. Where when I say fluid, it's like in a DAW, you might be mixing and people expect to be able to drop in a plugin at any point of time and make changes to, the signal flow and expect all that to be done seamlessly, right?
Yep.
And sample accurate. So DirectX didn't really support that. It wasn't built into the DNA of the framework. So we kind of realized we did some experiments trying to expand the framework and stuff and didn't have a lot of success. So back in 99, 2000, we did another huge rewrite of the whole engine. And that was like the thing and that's when we changed the brand and we made it Sonar.
Right.
So that was the first official version of Sonar, came out, I believe, in 2000 or maybe very early 2001. And that was basically a huge port going from the whole DirectX framework, and we kind of made the engine this. It's kind of similar to what we do today. It's like, I mean, obviously it's evolved, but it's the same framework where we can drop in components, without changing streaming. It's like while things are streaming, we can drop in components, pull out components, and things just work. That was Sonar. And then the next big change happened in 2003, which was Sonar 3, which is when we did the big push towards multiprocessing. That was literally, I mean, we always supported multi-threading. I mean, even Cakewalk Pro Audio 9 or 7 or whatever, it supported, like, the audio engine was always on a separate thread, and the user interface was on one thread. So, I mean, in those days, nobody had anything beyond dual cores, so it almost didn't matter.
Yep. Yeah. Or dual singles. If you're lucky, there was a dual single. Dual cores came a little bit later than that. Yeah. Yep.
Right. So it didn't matter then, but if you had your audio engine on one thread and the UI on one thread, it was probably good enough. But then you started getting quad-core machines and stuff like that later. So in 2003, we kind of switched to a proper model which allows you to do multiprocessing. That was the first big push towards that, where we made the whole engine completely scalable. And even in 2003, in theory, we could have thrown 16 cores at it because we were creating worker threads for each core.
Yep.
So that was the first big jump into multi-processing, 2003. 2004, 2005 was the next big jump where we were working very closely with Intel and 64-bit computing.
Yes.
And we kind of did the first prototype 64-bit native version of Cakewalk was available in 2004.
Right.
Maybe late 2003, 2004. I don't remember the date when it actually shipped, but that was, we had a 64-bit preview release, and then we did a whole bunch of benchmarks, like with Intel kind of showing, how the 64-bit registers were more efficient at doing mixing. That was one of the big things that we found.
Yep.
So obviously, when you turn on, like in Cakewalk, you can turn on 64-bit processing. It's still a flag, right? You don't have to, but it's almost, nobody turns it off these days because it's measurably faster to actually process things with 64-bit computing. The only downside to 64-bit computing is like you double the bandwidth, right? Because every buffer is twice as big because it's 64 bits.
Yeah. So we're talking about 64-bit processing. We're not talking about address space. So because the big change with 64-bit for a lot of people wasn't really the processing. It was more the ability to be able to access
we
more
did that
memory
at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was done at the same time. So 64. At the same time or very close, like in the same year. So the first cut was to switch all our processing, into using 64-bit double precision processing, right? Because all the early DSP and mixing code was all written using floating point.
Yes.
So unlike AAVIM, I think AAVIM was
fixed point
or DigiDesign.
Yeah.
They did like fixed point processing
for many years past that point as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So this was one of the early things we did. We switched to 64-bit, representation of all our data structures and all that. Then obviously we compile you build the app as a 64-bit application, because unless you build the app as a 64-bit application, it's not convenient to use the whole 64-bit address space.
Right.
So all of that was like in 2004, 2005.
And that was early days of XP64 from memory.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys were right at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. So we're now heading towards Sonar 4 or Sonar 5. Most of the releases, like between then to Sonar 5, 6, 7, 8 were all like feature releases. We did a whole bunch of new features. Just kept adding to that. But I would say, like, as we got towards the middle of 2006, 7, I think, is that the time that Vista came out? I'm trying to remember. When was Vista?
Well, I'm putting a timestamp on this. And when we were chatting was 2008, and that was Sonar 7.
Yeah.
And it might have been around that Vista, but I was kind of avoiding it like like the plague. Unless Vista was 2008, Pete. Can you put a timestamp on that?
I thought it was 2006, 7, but I think I'm going to have to verify that.
Yeah, so that feels about right. But I was staying well clear of Vista. I was doing the testing in XP64.
Yeah, I mean, there were obviously downsides to Windows Vista and all that, but I mean there were good parts to it too. I mean,
sure.
To the technology stack.
Yes.
Rather than
2006, 7.
2006, 7. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's about when we started doing, some of the WASAPI and all of that stuff happened around then. It's like we implemented support for WASAPI.
Yeah.
We were one of the first, if not the first DAW to actually support that. But
thank you very much.
We were, the main purpose of supporting WASAPI was not to provide a pro audio solution, right? But we wanted to support, the people who are running laptops and running, just desktop computers without high-end audio. Not every user is a high-end studio producer. So we wanted more support for, your onboard sound cards. And it was a complete nightmare trying to support those through MME and, just tech support would have like just insurmountable problems trying to get things working for people.
So can I just quickly ask, Wave RT, which kind of came and went and disappeared under, wasn't even barely a blip on the radar for most of us. Where does that fit in? So we're talking about WASAPI, but so what was Wave RT?
So can I just rewind? Like I forgot to mention one relatively major technology thing that might have been interesting to Pete as well.
Sure.
So back in 2000, right? And that kind of leads into Wave RT as well. That's why. So it's worth talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So 2009, 99, 2000 this is about the time where, Cakewalk was doing all kinds of cool stuff. And it's like we had a roundtable, discussing low latency audio and trying to get like a platform on Windows that did low latency audio in a stable way, right? So there was an initiative to actually build a new model, which was Windows only for low latency audio. And Ron Cooper, I think he called it WASABI, WASABI.
Yeah.
I forget what the acronym sounds like. It is Windows, model or something like that. But essentially, what WASABI was a layer of I/O controls, which is the low-level framework to actually communicate with the driver. But it had all the specific glue which allowed you to do low latency audio, so that you wouldn't have to rely. At the time, all anybody had was like MME, right? There was nothing else available.
Well, it wasn't Asia, so you guys weren't focusing on Asia back in the early days?
No, not at that time.
Okay.
So Azure was still fairly recent.
Yeah, it was very new.
It hadn't really acquired traction yet, and we were trying to build our own thing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this thing called WASABI, which we were building, which would be a replacement for MME, because MME used K-Mixer, which is the Windows mixer, and introduced like 30 to 50 milliseconds of latency, right? Which was unusable for pro audio, right?
Yep.
So Ron built this whole framework called WASABI, and there were people interested, and we were going ahead with this. And he had chats with people at Microsoft, and about the same time, it's like this framework kind of got rolled into what got known as KS, WDM-KS.
Yeah, kernel streaming. Yeah.
Kernel streaming. So kernels like MME, the MME framework, which is the original driver model on Windows, at the lowest level uses kernel streaming to communicate with the drivers, right?
Yeah.
But that was never available to application developers. And I think the first time Microsoft came out with that was probably in 99. So that's when we left behind all that stuff that we were trying to build, and we just adopted kernel streaming. So that was the driver for the longest time. I think probably about 3 or 4 years, Cakewalk just did kernel streaming.
And so this was WASABI with a B, like the
yes,
like the
like the hot sauce, yeah,
the hot stuff, as opposed to WASAPI, the Windows Audio Session API.
Yeah, so it was
how
kind
the
of
names are so similar.
I was going to ask. I wonder if somebody at Microsoft remembered WASABI and named it WASAPI. But yeah, they're completely two different things. Like WASAPI is different from what this thing is.
Yeah.
But yeah, kernel streaming was the first thing from Microsoft which actually allowed low latency audio to happen. I mean, it's like you could, even way back in 2000, you could run on really good audio hardware like Lynx systems and some of the others. You could run at you could get stable performance at 2 to 3 millisecond latencies, which was good enough at that time.
Yeah.
And you asked about Wave RT, right? So Wave RT is an extension that sits on top of kernel streaming. It's It's an extension. That's probably not the right terminology for it, but that's something that came out back in 2008.
Yeah, it was around the Vista. It was around Vista, or was it Windows? No, it was Vista. It was Vista.
Vista.
It's
yeah,
Vista.
At the same time, MMCSS and which we'll get to later. But at the same time, MMCSS and WaveRT were two of the things that were introduced with Vista from memory.
Yeah. The main thing that WaveRT did was actually kind of similar to ASIO. It allows you direct access to the buffer, right? Mm-hmm. It's the application has direct access to the audio buffer, and you can write into the audio buffer directly without queuing data.
Yes,
which is how the classic WDM framework works. You basically build a queue of buffers, and then you send the queue of buffers. I mean, WDM is pretty elegant. You can queue up multiple buffers and send it to WDM, and it'll play them, whenever the driver gets around to playing those buffers. But yeah, that was WaveRT. There's really not a lot to talk about WaveRT.
It didn't really get any traction. I remember a couple of smaller DAWs that implemented it, but it kind of just didn't grab anyone. So
I think around that time, most DAWs were already supporting ASIO, and it's kind of a shame. I wish in some ways that it was more like the Apple platform. It's like the Apple platform. There's core audio. Mm-hmm. And you don't need to do anything else. It's like you just use core audio. I mean, most DAWs just use core audio. I mean, nobody uses ASIO there. You don't. Well,
there is no ASIO on OS X. No, there is no.
You can't. In theory you could, right? Yeah. Nobody does. So.
But the downside is core audio, and I don't want this to be a Mac versus PC thing. Core audio, for its simplicity and just being able to plug stuff in, does a lot of extra for you, and that always ends up showing in the low latency benchmarks when you look at the differences there. And that's why when we've tried to look at alternatives to ASIO on Windows that are in the box, it always comes down to the latency figure. No matter what else you add feature wise, folks don't want to give up latency, but you have to get these other features in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, but it is elegant. I do like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's just some things about core audio that just, from an end user's point of view, I mean, you don't have to be a technical geek to set it up,
Yep.
You can do, I mean, this is not necessarily core audio, but even something as simple as on a Mac, I can take a MacBook, or I can take an iPad and plug it into a MacBook, and I can just play audio from the iPad to the MacBook. You can't do this on Windows without, third-party stuff. And so, there are certain layers of elegance that people didn't have to reinvent. Third-party vendors didn't have to reinvent on the Mac.
Yep.
So on Windows, I mean, Windows is really powerful because it's also powerful because of third parties, right? But it's not. That's probably one reason why so many people have not gravitated towards the PC, the creative sorts, because they don't want to get into all this geeky stuff that we're talking about right now. But
I mean, I think when we're talking about third parties, I think that because ASIO was so good and got so widely adopted, I think the path had already been set. My question would have been, why didn't Microsoft license ASIO? From Steinberg, but that's probably just a whole other
it's a whole other discussion.
Rabbit hole, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the downsides with that are, if you think about the stuff that we have in Windows for the average person, not the musicians, is when you have our mixer and our downsampling and all that stuff, you lose all of that with ASIO because it's one-to-one with the hardware, which I absolutely love it for music creation, but it kind of falls down on all these other scenarios. You can't do device aggregation even if you wanted to, without adding a whole pile of latency and stuff. So
correct.
Yeah. But it's so good, Vin, as you know this, it is so good an API and driver model for music creation that there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. It's just that's what folks want.
Yeah.
But Pete, you can even do mixing with Azure. I mean, it's like, and the good drivers, like take the RME drivers. It's like you can be sending stuff to an RME driver from different apps at different sample rates and different buffer sizes, and all the mixing and all the stuff is handled at the driver level. I mean, Windows doesn't play any role in any of that stuff. So
RME is a special company here. I think like their drivers do amazing things because they also do sort of built-in aggregation if they're all under the same driver, all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I do appreciate the fact that Windows, for like taking an RME out of the equation, it's like, the average driver or vendor who just builds a hardware device and wants things to work, and they don't have expertise in writing drivers. Windows gives you all that stuff out of the box for sure. So there are good things about Windows.
And even on Mac OS, RME uses a proprietary driver because they're just doing so much extra under the hood there, which is, to their benefit.
Yeah, just real quickly, and this was years ago, and I don't think it ever was completed, but I remember Charlie Steinberg was developing a multi-client aggregated ASIO driver. It was in development. Nothing came of it, but
actually, believe it or not, we have in our code, we have a multi-client ASIO driver. Which we built it when we were with Roland. Yeah, do you guys know what REAC is? REAC?
No,
I don't know.
Roland has this Ethernet-based their own solution for like network audio stuff for
like their own AVB or Dante type thing.
Right. It's their own product, super low latency protocol. But they had a problem that their thing was unidirectional. So it's like, you couldn't send, it wasn't a bidirectional protocol. So for monitoring, we actually wrote an ASIO aggregator device, which the driver obviously spoke to REAC and communicated with the REAC device over Ethernet. But it also allowed you to pick a local monitoring device, and it would, we'd sync up the two clocks and do it. So it is possible to do. It's just, I don't know why it's never really been done. It's just probably a lot of work. I mean,
yeah, the clock syncs I know can be a challenge.
Yeah,
and then there's always still like, if it costs you a millisecond of latency to do all that sync, then it just doesn't take off.
Yeah,
still a cool idea though.
You don't. I mean, the latency hit would only happen when you were using it in that mode, right? So I mean, at that point, you don't care. I mean, if you're using just a single device, you won't have the latency hit.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, that whole aggregate device thing is interesting, and especially when you're mixing audio interfaces from different manufacturers, and if you don't have them word clock together, I have, I'm kind of struggling to kind of figure out.
Well, that's how Core Audio does all that clock sync internally, which is quite a feat on their part.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. All right.
But that's where the additional latency comes from, or part of it anyway.
Yeah. Well, look, the whole ASIO versus Core Audio and latency, I wrote quite a bit about it about 10 years ago and got enormous pushback from the Mac community, basically saying I was full of it, but I had some internal information from a driver developer of why there was an inherent latency with Core Audio over ASIO, and then Matthias clearly defined it on our podcast, so I won't go into it now. But there is there is an underbonnet reason why the ASIO is always more efficient than the Core Audio at the low latencies, and it had something to do with how many calls to the OS per sample, and so we won't cover it again now. But there is a reason why ASIO is still why we still get better low latency performance on the Windows platform with ASIO than Core Audio in general. Now, one thing I do want to move on to, Noel, is let's move up to the present, because Cakewalk has been going through some significant shifts with ownership and stuff, and I'll get you to cover that a little bit. But I think if you can just bring us up to date, bring us up to the present with some of the shifts from with the ownership changes, and also I want to kind of get into the current challenges with multi-core and multi-processing, especially at low latency in Windows, and also I want to hit the MMCSS area because that's something that came up in conversation with the three of us as we were preparing for this show. So I think can you just cover the shifts in ownership for us and tell us exactly where you've landed, and then we can get into this multiprocessor stuff.
Sure. So as you guys know, it's like our first shift in ownership was with Roland acquiring Cakewalk, which happened sometime around 2007. I mean, we worked with Roland like many years, so had a long relationship with them dating back to the 90s, really. And I mean, it was a good time. Roland took over Cakewalk. We did several joint products with them. I think the biggest one that people might remember was the VS700,
yes,
which was like a full workstation, right? Multi-track audio recorder and a control surface. Good product.
Impressive chunk of hardware.
Not supported very well. Unfortunately, died a early death. That's the only regret. But there were good things that came out. There were lots of other joint products that came out of the Cakewalk Roland relationship. And Roland kind of changed direction and decided they wanted to move into a different space. They were not doing very well at the time. So I think they ended up selling Cakewalk to Gibson back in 2013, I believe. 2012, 2013. And that was the next big shift. Gibson was a kind of a strange candidate to pick Cakewalk because they were not in the audio production space as such. I mean, they were, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. And that was around the same time they also acquired Tascam from
Tascam.
Yes.
Yeah, Tascam was not owned by Gibson. I mean, TIAC, I think it was part ownership.
Right.
So
okay.
It's not like they fully acquired the company, but there was Onkyo, there was Tascam. Yeah, he acquired like a whole bunch of pro audio companies, right? Hardware, microphones, neat microphones. And I mean, it was a pretty grand plan. I mean, it could have worked, but the bottom line is like in any acquisition thing like this, you really need to have very strong leadership and focus and a direction. You can't just buy a bunch of companies and put them around and hope for the best, right? It's not going to work.
Right. Just throw it in a basket and hope for the best. Yeah.
Yeah. Shake it up and see what happens. And, I was kind of excited because I said, wow, I mean, like Tascam's a great company. I knew some of the engineers at Tascam working with them over the years, and they're all great guys. Tascam Japan, the engineers are super nice guys, like same kind of work ethic, it's like they're all musicians and, love the industry, do great stuff. And unfortunately, the mix didn't work because there was just not enough leadership and push towards making all this synergy work. I mean,
no, I remember I think it was around that time you guys had a cool like studio in a box bundle with some Tascam hardware and Cakewalk and a bunch of other stuff, right?
That was the whole thing. We were working with Intel and we've always been working with Intel, just like we work with Microsoft. So the big push was on the NUCs and Tascam, they bundled one of their audio interfaces with the NUC, and we kind of, road tested that machine, made sure that it worked, and we put it out. It's like they built a limited number of units, and it was actually available at Guitar Center for some time. I forget what it
was such a cool idea for folks that are just getting into things,
Yeah.
I think it was a little overpriced. I think it was like about $800 or $900 for the whole kit. Which is, it's stretching the line for what people are going to pay for, So I think it wasn't super successful.
Yeah, you should explain to the listeners what a NUC is. I mean, we know what a NUC is, but some may not.
Yeah, Pete can do that.
Yeah, it's a little it's a very small form factor computer. People who are familiar with like the Mac Mini, it's kind of a similar size and shape and stuff.
Yeah.
But the idea is you have a whole computer that's smaller than a sandwich on your desk that has everything that you need in it.
Yeah. So it is a tiny little computer about the size of a Mac Mini. Yeah. Cool. All right.
They're pretty awesome. They're actually more powerful than laptops in many ways.
Yeah.
Well, I think the original ones had mobile CPUs, but some of the later ones
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, but then the later ones started using some more of the powerful desktop CPUs.
When we did, when we worked with, who was it that? Oh, now the name's gonna. Yeah, I can't remember the name. But we worked with a company who did their. I can't believe I can't remember their name. That their new MPC. It actually had a
Akai.
Thank you. I don't know why that's fallen out of my head. That had a NUC inside it for their prototyping work, right? Because it's super easy to do. It's just you plop in a computer and that's it.
Seriously, the later MPCs had a NUC sitting in the guts.
No, this was the prototype. I don't know what was in production, but in the prototype.
But that's interesting in itself that the later MPCs are basically x86 based. I had no idea.
Yeah, I don't know now. But they had, it's a computer in a box. Or like all the DAW-less stuff that you see people doing these days. There's still a DAW. It just happens to be a single-purpose device.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
I'm speaking to you through a NUC at the moment.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Brave move.
Nice.
No, it's really stable and it's super quiet. I mean, there's no noise at all from it. It's actually, it's perfect. I mean, it's an 8-core. I mean, not 8 physical.
4 with hyper threading.
Yeah, but for a basic DAW, it's perfectly viable. I mean,
there you go. Yeah. So yes, let's scroll back. Tascam. So not Tascam. Sorry, Gibson.
Yeah. So Gibson are. I mean, we built a lot of cool stuff, software, like Sonar X3 was built while we were with Gibson. Mm-hmm. We focused on, a lot of stability things and built a whole bunch of new features. We did touch, multi-touch support.
Yep.
There are a lot of cool things that happened during that time. I mean, it didn't realize the breadth of what it was supposed to be. We were supposed to build this whole ecosystem of connected products, right? And we'd have these meetings every year, twice a year, where we'd fly and meet all the leaders of all the various divisions, Onkyo, and they would have like technical presentations on their next generation products. Super exciting stuff. It's like Onkyo was working on some amazing things. Tascam was working on great stuff. All of us. And it just never came to fruition.
Yeah, and this was this about the point where, because I know you've got a patent on the multiprocessing and
the load balancing.
Load balancing in Windows. Yeah. Was that around that time?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly.
So can you tell us a bit about that?
It's towards the end of that time for sure. So 2016. So and I was, we've always been experimenting with, multiprocessing through the years. But one of the ideas that I had was like getting around the bottlenecks with multiprocessing, which is like subdividing workloads in a DAW to feed your cores, because any multiprocessing is only as good as how much you can subdivide the task to be processed, right?
Sure.
So if most DAWs, including us, until that time, all we did is like split up things at the track level, right? So it's like if you're processing, it's serialized. So you say my project has got like 64 tracks. I'm going to take those 64 tracks and split them up among all my cores that I have available and let the cores process them. But they're still serial because till you finish processing one buffer, your core is not going to be able to subdivide any work.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I have one track that's got 10 plugins in a row, those are all going to be done serially on like one thread.
They have to be done on one thread, one core.
Yeah.
So, and the problem, of course, is like in today's world, it's like the biggest load in any project actually comes from plugins. It's not from streaming audio. Streaming audio is nothing these days, you know. But so it's all with plugin load. So multiprocessing only would take you that far. It's like you could have a 64 core machine, and it would still come to its knees because you're not. If you looked at Task Manager, you'd see that the cores are not working. They're not being overworked, rather. So the goal in any kind of good multiprocessing system is to make sure that you're feeding every idle cycle in as far as possible for your cores.
Right.
So I started thinking about like how we can get past that problem, and so I built this load balancing algorithm based on a technique called pipelining, parallel pipelining, which is it's like a divide and conquer mechanism where you subdivide buffers. So it's like when you're processing a rack of plugins, instead of sending a buffer and waiting for 10 plugins to finish processing them, you subdivide the buffers and then you process the subdivided buffers in parallel.
But this is within one track. So what would be usually processed in a serial fashion on one core, you've managed to load balance across that. Is that correct?
Yes. So an easy way to visualize this is like, just imagine you had one track. Let's say you had a 16-core machine and you had a single track in the project, right? Under normal use, you would only see one core used, correct? Because you're not subdividing. With load balancing, I can subdivide, or I can split up that one track into 16 parts. So I can use all 16 cores to process that one track.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting, because that brings back the whole clock versus core debate as well, because it to actually play the virtual instruments in real time at ultra low buffers, it's beneficial to have clock over core, and that's always the argument. So what you've managed to do is, well, not completely eliminate that, but what you've managed to do is you've taken the serial process within one track that and the danger there for a lot of people is when they start piling in the plugins serially, that they clip that one core and it brings the whole session down. You've managed to split that the load on that one track into a multi-process. That is very, very unique. Very unique.
So Noel, let me take an attempt at explaining this to see if I have it right. So let's say you're working with 64 samples or something like that. Okay. So you might break that up, if you have 4 cores available, into 16 sample blocks, right? So you have 4 16 sample blocks. You feed the first one in, and plugin 1 processes that. And then when that first 16 samples goes on to the second plugin, you're starting the second sample set, the second on the first plugin. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's super cool.
Yeah, it's very super cool. I have a nice diagram in the patent which actually shows how it's all split up. But it's pretty cool. The thing is, like anything, it all breaks down when you're starting to run it. If you run at really low latency, you can't do that, right? Because, where do you subdivide? And subdivision has its cost too. It's like, as you know, Pete, it's like context switching a processor has got its own fixed cost. So that's why raw clock speed is ultimately, that's going to win, This is the debate about clock speed versus more cores. You get with more cores and subdivision, you get diminishing returns after a certain point in a real-time system.
A clock wins in a serial process, but the thing is that on a usual session, you can't dismiss the number of multi-cores as well. If you're intelligent enough to the way that you lay out the session, that you can load balance. It doesn't have to be exact, but if you can load balance across the processors, especially in these larger sessions, the multi cores will then start being of more benefit to a simple clock speed. And this has always been the debate, and you kind of keep reading it. It's almost like pigeon chess. Anytime it comes up, and you've got these people lining up on either side where the clock is more important than core.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's both. Right?
Yeah, of course. You can't say, clock speed isn't important, because of course it is, right? But you got to find a nice balance. And this is one thing that I've always tried to present, saying, okay, most modern CPUs, all-core turbo, or whatever AMD call it, I can't remember what AMD call it, but Intel call it all-core turbo. We're not talking about turbo clock. So, the marketing departments will go, well, these things will run at 5.3 gigahertz. Well, they won't. One core will spin up at 5.3 gigahertz. And that's not the way we actually use them with DAW. So the more important spec, which they don't really kind of throw in your face, is the all-core turbo capability of the CPUs, right? So, and I'll just give you some examples. I say if we're talking X299 series of the HEDT Intel platform, and we'll say, let's take the 10 core, which I think is around 3.6 is the base clock, okay, without any turboing. And then they'll say, it'll spin up to 4.8 turbo clock, which you never really see in a DAW.
Yeah.
But the all-core turbo on that CPU is actually around 4.3. So the real working frequency is around 4.3. 4.3 gigahertz is some pretty healthy clock speed, right?
Yeah.
So you can get a stack done in real time with 4.3 gigahertz without a problem. Even around that 4 gigahertz, even around up that 3.8. The only time that you're really going to be needing that thing up floating around 5, you've got to be pushing the absolute extreme edges, So let's say you got something floating around 4 gigahertz. You've got plenty of clock to do everything that you need, but then you've got the multiple cores. Now, with either the AMD or the Intels, even up to the 14, 16 cores, we're talking 4 gigahertz above clock, right? So for me, the whole argument of clock versus core, I kind of switch off, because I said we're only talking about a couple hundred megahertz in real terms. And if you're pushing a session or an environment where you need a couple of extra gigahertz, overclock the bloody thing if you really need to, Mm-hmm. So I don't buy into the, clock is more important than cores. Like Pete said, I think they're both very, very important. And especially for my clients that are running these huge orchestral and virtual instrument sessions, the clock is important, yes, when they're playing the stuff in real time, but the number of cores always win out in the end. So, those guys are running 16 and 18 core machines. And that's one of my main target clients.
And it's often moot as well when you start getting into laptops and throttling and all the other stuff.
Yeah,
this all makes sense in desktops that are adequately cooled.
Of course.
Yeah.
But look, it's surprisingly these little laptops. I do some just the mobile based laptops, and they'll say 2.5 gigahertz. No, they're not. Those babies are running at above 4 gigahertz or core, and mind you, they get pretty warm. And then they might throttle back a couple hundred megahertz or so, but and they do throttle back before they hit that peak. That's what a lot of people don't realize, right? But they don't run at that 2.5. So I'm thinking, I'm trying to remember the number. I think it's a 10750H is the 6-core 12-thread. I think that's the one. So I finished one off last week, and I'm watching the clocking as it's burning in, and it was at 4.1, 4.2, and then once I started getting into those upper temp, because I'm running the thing at 100% CPU flat out for hours at a time, and it would drop back to 3.8, 3.9, and this is on a laptop.
That's not too bad though.
It's quite good, and this is on a laptop that doesn't give me the benefit of hopping into the BIOS and switching off all of that clocking stuff. This is purely managed by the Windows power profile, Pete, which you'd be quite happy to know, right? I've actually got a highly modified one, but it's actually all of that.
Of course you do.
Well, all of that clocking is handled by the power profile. and
Cool.
and they sit happily at all-core turbo at idle, which is, when you say happily, for a laptop, you're going, what are you doing to me? But I set them up like I do on the desktop machine. And if the client needs, any resemblance of battery life, they've got to switch the power profile.
Noel, sorry, I dragged us way off topic.
No, that's he wanted to know about the multi-core stuff. So
No, but that was important because that patent is very, very important. So I think what I want to talk about now is, mate, it's like a bugbear for me. MMCSS. Now, I thought I'd actually signed off and signed out talking about MMCSS because myself and Pete have been navigating it it's on 3 years now, Pete. All right. So it was probably around, or even more. So it was around the start of 2018 where we really started hitting some walls with this. And we've spoken about it multiple times. I've written a whole stack of reports. I really don't even want to talk about the whole MMCSS Steinberg area, right? But the reason I'm bringing it up is that when we were preparing for the show, and we were in a group chat with Noel, and he says, "Hey guys, I've encountered this problem with MMCSS thread limiting. Do you know anything about it?" Now, I was drinking a cup of tea, almost spat it out. I went, "What? Yeah, we know a little bit about it." And so this is an area that surprised me because here's a software developer that encountered the multimedia class scheduler limit that we were hitting 3 years ago with another software developer.
Yeah.
And, again, we all signed off. We have what we call an unofficial fix to actually raise the thread limits. And then Noel brings it up. And so he was kind of almost oblivious. So, Noel, can you pick up the ball on that one? Because that one really surprised me that it had sat under the radar for you for all of those years.
Well, yeah, I only found out by accident.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying.
I was fixing some stuff with our MMCSS implementation, completely tangentially talking to some other people at Microsoft. And it so turned out like we had MMCSS doesn't release the registrations with when the threads are being destroyed, which I think is really strange, but that's the way it is. Whether it's by design or a bug is anybody's guess. But it so turned out that we were prematurely running into this limit, and I started seeing these warnings in our logs. We trace information in our builds to when errors happen with the MMCSS system. And I started seeing these errors, and then I actually looked into the error codes, and the error code was reporting that there aren't sufficient resources.
Right.
I said, I didn't even know there was a finite resource for MMCSS.
There you go. You hit the ceiling. Yep.
Yeah. So that's how it came up. But the thing is, I was running into it on my machine, which doesn't really have a huge number of cores. I got 16 cores.
Well, eight cores, 16 threads.
It's 16 threads.
Yes.
But the thing is, it kind of ties into what we were talking about with plug-in load balancing. Because when we do plug-in load balancing, we actually create a different thread pool, which has got extra threads.
Yes.
And all of these threads get registered under MMCSS.
Right.
And between this
Your
and that,
own
I was
thread
blowing
pool.
I was exactly our own thread pool. So I was blowing past this limit and getting all these warnings in our code.
Yep.
So that's when I pinged you guys on that thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've had a lot of discussions with the teams on this, and we did a horrible job of getting the news out there that, hey, we've limited the number of available MMCSS threads when the stuff was moved to the kernel. In fact, we didn't tell anybody.
No.
That's like,
Maybe they won't
we
notice.
just did it.
We'll just make this change, see if anyone notices. Yeah.
Yeah. And the assumption that the team is making is like, oh, well, everybody should be using the worker queue, our thread pool, and just getting the threads from there and returning them to there. And it's my assumption that that's why the threads don't get automatically destroyed, null or deregistered or whatever at the end, because the idea is that they be returned to the pool. But nobody's doing this.
Invite some of your guys to use a few DAWs.
Yeah, I think that's the next task. But like nobody's gonna change all their internal threading code. This is like the most core thing inside a DAW is your threading code. So nobody's gonna change it to do that. But apparently there's a finite resource in the kernel for these MMCSS threads. I don't know what that is yet. And if you boost it up to a certain amount, then your PC starts to tank. But I have yet to see that in action.
Yeah, we don't know that upper ceiling yet. But the thing is with that, Pete, is that, and this is where Noel hit that mark, was that, so there was 32 threads available.
Yeah,
and this is my understanding from the explanation, the original explanation from Steinberg. So 32
per process. Yeah,
32 threads available. So 32 thread available. 4 were reserved by the operating system, which left 28. So the initial discussion when we started encountering this was, okay, so you're going to need a 14-core, 28-thread machine before we're really going to start hitting this. And we weren't going to see it because a majority of people weren't at that core level.
Right.
Then it was discovered that each call to the process spins up 2 threads, which then halved it to 14 total, 14 logical total, which meant that anything above a 6-core, 12-thread CPU could encounter some issues by going over that we'll call it 14 logical limit. Right.
Yeah,
now,
and I don't understand that double allocation there, why that happens.
But it did actually pan out. So we had that 14 logical core limit. That was Steinberg's early kind of patch. They just said, hey, here's a little bit of a script. It's going to limit it to 14 logical. And how that actually manifested out in the real world was that, I'm starting to sell systems into the 10, 12, up to 16 core type of area at the time, and clients are reporting back to me saying, hey Vin, I've had to go back to the old 6-core machine because Cubase is just fallen on its ass. I've got 1 track of audio running, I've got some virtual instruments, contact or whatever else, and this one slipped under my radar because I do a whole stack of benching before I send these machines out. Now, for whatever reason, the sessions that I was testing it with didn't trigger this problem, but when it was being triggered,
even if you saw the problem, it would be hard to notice as an end user because
Noel, these were bringing down the systems to the point where you couldn't even play a virtual instrument live. A single virtual instrument.
Why it would do that?
Well, because the session was already being load balanced, right, across the multiple cores, and then whatever they were using was then triggering that core limit above the core limit, and it was tanking these systems very dramatically. So
in Cubase, you said that, right?
This is only in Cubase, right?
Yeah, I don't understand why, because the thing is, even when I was running into that issue on my end, right? I was not noticing any obvious performance problems. No, but just that it's not using MMCSS.
But the thing is, Noel, we don't know exactly what dependency Steinberg has coded in. So it's obviously exactly. very, very different to everyone else. So whatever they did, they invested very, very heavily into that code, into an area of the program that when you were running this thing in real time, right, even with very minimal load on the machine, it would completely tank, completely. So they come up with this kind of patch for the 14 threads. That wasn't good enough for me, and again I've gone over it multiple times. So I worked very diligently with Pete and some other colleagues behind the scene, and it took a while, but we did get this unofficial fix, and I'm doing air quotes, that allowed us to raise it to 128 threads. Now that is the patch that I sent you, which actually resolved your problem. But it remains unofficial because it does get overwritten with updates and upgrades. I think upgrades more so than updates. So it's just the whole area was very interesting for me that the developers, a lot of the developers would be looking at my reports going, what is he talking about? I have no idea what because they've never hit the limit. Now, is that because what I was thinking out loud was, are these guys actually coding on higher core systems that has
you wouldn't notice it. I think even if you were not looking for the problem, it's unlikely you would notice it. Like unless you had some debugging code or something which would let you know that you were hitting that limit. Because I said, it's like I don't notice. Like if you were playing something in Cakewalk and you were running into that limit, you probably wouldn't notice anything different.
But that's only because you're under a core limit that is staying under that 32 thread limit.
No, even if you were hitting the limit, even if you were hitting that limit, you may not notice anything obvious because MMCSS. This is where it starts getting esoteric. I mean, it's like, to be really honest, I'm not sure what great benefits you get from MMCSS. MMCSS is an insurance policy that tells the scheduler not to preempt your threads when it's under load, from other external influences, right?
Right.
So, I mean, in reality, it's like somebody running or finely tuned DAW is not going to be doing network activity, and not like what we're doing right now. It's like, having a conference call at the same time while you're doing a session, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people tune their system. So if you're tuning your system and your DAW is the only one doing the work, I mean, is MMCSS going to really benefit you? I'm not sure. It's just like insurance.
But that's a really loaded question. What, and again, you can't answer the question, is that what investment did Steinberg put into the program that was so detrimental with that thread limiting?
It probably also matters with how they're doing the allocation, right? Like how do they, when you get that error, then MMCSS says it can't register another thread. Like, what is their code doing at that point?
Exactly.
Is it falling back to just a normal thread, or is it just like, nope, I'm out, right?
It's following in. Pete, it's funny you say that because we ran into a bug with MMCSS with a driver, which was resulting in disastrous performance. Ironically, the user who reported this to me was a Microsoft employee who's also a heavy DAW user, and he wrote back saying that I'm getting like dropouts and like all kinds of major performance problems. And after like doing a bunch of troubleshooting with him, I had him turn off MMCSS in Cakewalk. And his problem went away.
Yeah, and what was the audio interface, Noel? Do you remember?
It was a Lynx.
Yeah.
It was a Lynx audio interface.
Yes.
And what it turned out to be? It was a bug in the driver that if the driver thread had been registered as MMCSS, he tried to register the driver thread as MMCSS, who wrote the driver.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And it obviously fails because the DAW has already registered the thread as MMCSS, and it fell into some failure code path which actually wrecked the driver, basically. So so these are coding errors, It's like just simple. So maybe this was just a simple coding error that got fixed.
Well, it's interesting. RME have they have a checkbox whether you want to run the driver under MMCSS or not. So
that's a wise way to do it. Yeah. I think every driver vendor should do that. Or let the DAW do it, because as I explained before, it's like any kind of multi-threading you do, you want all threads to be treated equally. Yeah. It makes no sense for the driver thread to be at the highest priority and the rest of the world to be running at a lower priority. So it's. But honestly, I don't know whether we're splitting hairs here, because MMCSS is as long as there are no bugs in the system, I mean, I don't think it should matter one way or the other, greatly.
It's another tool, right?
So. Yeah, it's another tool, yeah.
Well, look, and the way that it was resolved by Steinberg, resolved again, I'm doing air quotes, was that instead of implementing the raising of the MMCSS threads, which completely resolved the problem for my clients. I mean, I've got screenshots of 16 core, 32 threads running at, lowest buffer settings, and everything's pegged. The task manager's sitting at 98th percentile. The Steinberg meters are completely pegged. The playback's working. The guy's moving the mouse around. I mean, it fixed it. All right. So, and we handed that to the guys there at the developers at Steinberg. They chose not to implement it. The changes that they made at the Cubase 10 is, again, I've been going around in circles for ages, but it's a very strange fix as far as I'm concerned. The real-time engine, as soon as you activate anything in regards to real-time, it drops total number of cores by half -1. Right? So how they came up with that mathematic, and that's only on a system with 8 cores and above. 6-core, 12-thread, it sees every thread, whether you got your ASIO guard on or off, a real-time engine, it works exactly as it did before. Anything above that, and there's that 14 logical core thing, all right? That's the only thing I can make out. Anything above 8 core and above, it drops half the logical -1, and then lands all the processing on the first core, physical core, then it skips, and then it skips all the rest of the physical cores and lands the rest of it on logical cores. I have no idea what they're doing. I don't particularly care any further from this point. It was just interesting for me that you'd hit that limit. We managed to resolve it for you, but here you are saying that it wasn't really going to be causing too much of a problem, or not to the point of where it was bringing sessions down. So, and it just comes down to the level of commitment people have made to that MMCSS area. Yeah, okay, all right. Well, look, one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Noel, is hybrid playback engines in the DAWs, which a lot of the other DAWs have implemented. That's not something that's part of the Cakewalk playback engine.
Not yet.
No, not
yet.
It's not yet. Here we go. You've heard it here first. There you go.
Yeah, it's a cool. It's like Pete says. It's another technique, right?
Right.
It's just something we haven't gotten to. We'd probably look into it at some point. It's there are challenges that are involved in actually pre-buffering data so that you can actually process them ahead of time. There are only that many days that we have to work on stuff, and performance is one of the things that we work on. To some extent, I think users are more concerned about like workflow and making things run smoother in terms of like the operations they do rather than performance. Performance is very important, of course, for people who are running like massive workloads like you guys, right? Running 200 instances of Contact or 300, like 1,000 tracks. Performance makes a huge deal to those kinds of users, but the majority of users are doing, normal operations, music production operations. And probably things that are more important to them are like how fast can they perform a certain task that they're trying to do, editing tasks. And so of late, we've been focusing more on that, just improving the workflow. But yes, we'll get to it.
Nice.
Yeah. And again, and hybrid playback engines are a two-edged sword anyway, because some of the implementations have not delivered the expected performance, and instead of actually being detrimental in some instances, especially as the core counts were rising. So again, two-edged sword. But it's an interesting area. I mean, Reaper does it a little bit differently to everyone else, where they've got a thing called an anticipative process, where the extended buffer is actually pre, not post. So it's not extending.
That is cool.
The playback buffers. They're actually they're pre-buffering a whole stack of stuff, and then still playing everything back at the native playback buffer. So everyone's got a slightly different angle on the area. Now, I think we should move on to Cakewalk at and BandLab, which is pretty exciting for you guys. So we can pick up where you left off with you're at Gibson. Now, from my understanding, the end at Gibson was pretty abrupt. It was, to put it politely. Do you want to
put it politely? Yeah.
Do you want to pick up the ball there and tell us that transition, and then and give the listeners a nice overview, or an overview of what BandLab is as a company and as a community and a culture. Can you do that for us? Yeah, cool.
So Gibson, as we talked about earlier, it's like, we had all these brands, and the goal was to try and build this ecosystem of connected products and brands which never really happened. So we kind of saw the writing on the wall, at a certain point. It's like things were like falling apart, and like there was no planning going on. So it was just a matter of time, and it was very sudden, as you say. It's like we arrived one day and heard that the company was shutting down. Yeah. Or they would. Well, we hadn't even heard the details about Gibson's Chapter 11 filing at that time. It's like Cakewalk was the first company to get cut, but in short order, like literally in like 2 or 3 months, we heard about Gibson, and we heard about all the other brands being cut.
Wow.
So Cakewalk was not an exception to that, but there was a period like about, let me see, we shut down, officially closed end of November. Myself and a few other people stayed on just to essentially close shop, right? And collect resources. And Gibson started looking to sell the company. I mean, that was always the plan. I mean, when they shut us down. Although it was pretty scattered, so nobody really knew. I mean, not even us. Like we didn't know who Gibson was talking to or anything like that. It's like I was involved in a few of those things where, since I was the CTO, I had all the knowledge of the technical IP. So I had to talk to some of the potential people interested. But besides that, there was like a dark period of about 2 months where nobody knew where things were moving forward. So it was pretty unfortunate. A lot of customers were kind of panicking. They rely on this DAW for their daily work. But somewhere in the middle of all of that, it's like I got solicited by Meng, who's the CEO of BandLab, and he invited me to join BandLab. And this is actually before the Cakewalk acquisition.
Right.
And
okay.
So you personally then he invited to join?
Yes. So I kind of thought about it. I'd never honestly, I'd heard of BandLab in passing because he had actually contacted us at Cakewalk a long time earlier when we were working on this Momentum product because he had an interest in some of the stuff we were doing. But I hadn't personally dealt with him before, but I read up about their company and I was very interested in what they were working on because it was a direct extension of some of the things I had done in 2017, working on Momentum, which was this cloud-based platform to connect to your DAW and share sessions between the DAW and the cloud and then move it between different DAWs and all of that. BandLab isn't quite that. The Momentum was kind of plugin based, but right. BandLab is this whole ecosystem which it's like almost it's a social network for musicians, in Meng's words. And it's very exciting because not only do they run on all the mobile platforms, you can also run it on the web. You can run it in a web browser. Yep. And so he wanted me to like lead the effort for bringing it to the desktop. So very exciting to me. So I decided to join BandLab, and coincidentally, around that time frame, he put in a bid to buy Cakewalk.
Right. Okay.
And things moved very rapidly. It's like just coincidentally, I mean, nobody knew whether somebody else would buy the product, whether Gibson would move on that, because nobody was communicating clearly about all of this. But it so happened that I joined them, and like in short order, it's like end of February, the deal got settled, and he ended up buying Cakewalk, or buying the assets, Cakewalk assets, which meant all the code base for Sonar, and all our plugins and all the other assets that we had.
Awesome. So the band got back together.
Yes.
Yes.
So he already had Noel, right? So did other people come and join, or like what was that like?
So basically, there were just two of us. I joined sometime in January. Yep. And at the end of February or early March, when the Cakewalk acquisition happened, no, I think that was March. I can't remember now. We hired another developer from the Cakewalk team, but there were just two of us.
But that's nice for continuity, though.
Yeah, two of us. So Ben, the other developer, he was very strong on a lot of the user interface and all of that he had worked on. So it's like for a while, it's like there were just two of us. Myself and him were working on Cakewalk all through the first version of Cakewalk in March 2018, April. And then we kind of ramped up, hired a few more people. And it's kind of all distributed now. It's like we got 2 people in the UK. We've got about 6 of us here in the US. There's somebody in Hawaii. It's and we've been doing this since 2018. So pre-COVID, we've been all remote.
Yeah,
nice.
And of course, BandLab is in Singapore.
Yeah.
So we did a whole bunch of trips to Singapore, planning and trying to figure out where we're going to go. And BandLab's an interesting company. It's very web centric, and their goal is to build an ecosystem of music which is very social. So that's the primary goal. It's like BandLab is the social. It's like Facebook for musicians, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it is. It's like the application is a proper social media app. I mean, it's like you can have posts, you can have comments, you can have. It's not like SoundCloud. Like SoundCloud is like you post your song and people can post comments on your song, right? In BandLab, you actually have messaging and you have all the classic social media elements, right? And very unique to BandLab is they've got this whole concept of like a revision-based workflow, which is you can post a song and you can post as many revisions to the song as you want. And you can choose to share. They have a very a geeky word for it. They call it forking.
Right.
So you can take any revision of your song and you can fork it and make it publicly visible to another user, and another user can branch that song and make different revisions of that. So it's very.
It's like GitHub terminology.
Yeah. It's a little geeky,
and you have to be very careful how you pronounce it as well.
So Noel, when I met Mang, and also the stories I've heard, what impressed me is he's not just he wasn't just buying the acquisition like somebody would buy a car. He seemed to be really into this space and knowledgeable about it.
Yeah. He was a Cakewalk user. He liked Cakewalk, and that's really why he wanted to buy Cakewalk. And I think he felt something for it. He felt like the customers were kind of left abandoned. And he wanted to do something. And it's completely, I mean, I have full respect for him. I mean, the fact that he's bought the company, he bought Cakewalk, and as you guys know, it's like it's free.
Yeah.
He took a $500 product and made it free.
Yeah.
It's like, which was surprising to everybody, including me. I thought he would take the product and, we would release like the equivalent of what we called Sonar Home or Sonar Home Studio, which would be a scaled back version of the product. Maybe it would do something like 24 tracks or something like that. But no, he said, I want to empower musicians. I want them to, have access to the same tools that everybody else has. So
And usually when I hear stuff like that, I'm like, all right, that smells a little fishy. But
what's the catch?
I've come to appreciate. I've come to appreciate from Meng and team here that that's actually legit. So
it's legit.
That has impressed me.
There's no strings attached. I mean, a lot of users initially, if you read the earlier threads, it's like everybody thought like, who is this company from Singapore? We've never heard of them. And, there's got to be some catch. They're going to sell your songs. They're going to sell your data. Here we are sitting 3 years later. I mean, March is going to make 3 years that we've been with BandLab, and nothing dire has happened. No. It's still free.
And you have a full team, and you're all still working on it.
Yeah.
If anything, the product is like way better than it's been in the last 6 years, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the thing is that, BandLab already had a community. So what kind of numbers are we talking about in regards to the community at BandLab?
Are you attached to your seat right now?
Yeah.
So the last I checked, our user base is close to 29 million.
What?
At BandLab.
So that would have definitely filtered into a spike in Cakewalk users.
Yes, I mean, there's no way there are going to be 29 million Cakewalk users. But
but that's what I'm about to say. So there'll be other. If any of the other software developers are listening in now, I reckon they have. Everything's tightened up and they're falling off their seat. Yeah, but it's yes, we've had a dramatic increase in users. Well, obviously because it's free, right? I mean, it's like there were a lot of people who were interested in Cakewalk before, but to be realistic, is like how many casual users are going to plunk like $400 or $500 of course,
to buy something, unless this is something you're going to use on a daily basis or often enough.
And that philosophy there, Noel, just quickly, sorry for cutting you off, was why Reaper has picked up a whole stack of users, because Justin had that license model where he said
he had that very early.
Yeah, you can give me $50 if you earn under 20 grand, and if you're a professional studio, you give me whatever it is, a $299 or whatever. So it's still very affordable either way. But he had that. Yes. He had that philosophy of saying, you know what, not everyone can afford $250, $300 for a piece of software. So, and Meng went one step further, saying, you know what, here's the full version for free. Where a lot of the other developers will give a starter, we'll call it a taster version with limited tracks. So some of them don't even allow you to insert a plugin. So if you want to insert a plugin, you either pay an additional amount to have a VST plugin option, or you buy the full version. But again, and like you said, full respect to Meng, he just went, no, I don't want to cut down version. Let's just give him the full thing,
Yeah, nobody can afford to do this, generally speaking, right? I mean, it's like if you're, most DAW developers are small companies. I mean, Cakewalk was a small company, even before BandLab.
You'll find that most of them are. Noel, and that's why there's so many acquisitions, and you can fill in the blank. Most DAW companies have been acquired by a larger umbrella company, most, if not all, Yeah.
But even the larger company, it's all relative, right? I mean, it's like, I think BandLab are probably, Roland was pretty big, but BandLab is one of the larger in terms of like headcount. I mean, it's like it's a relatively big company. They've grown a lot since when they started only in 2013 or something like that. It's a very young company.
Yeah.
But obviously, they can manage financially because of the backing of the founder.
Yes.
But, we're all small. I mean, it's like all the top companies are all relatively small, even including Steinberg. Steinberg got acquired by Yamaha, which is a massive company.
Yes.
And, I've come to learn, it's at least for this kind of software, it's like you do your best stuff when you're small, It's like if having 100 developers is not going to make a better product necessarily.
No, everyone's going to point the finger at everyone else when something else goes wrong. That wasn't my area.
you can come out with more stuff, but whether that stuff is of higher quality is debatable.
Yeah, of course.
It's the same reason, Noel, that a lot of our feature teams in Windows are actually quite small, because that's how you get stuff done. And it's also why we never release numbers, because somebody will see like his favorite feature out there and find out there's only like 4 people working on it. They're just like, what? 4 people? I expected to be 100 people working on it.
Yeah,
software doesn't work that way.
Yeah, of course.
I don't think most people who think about Cakewalk even realize how small we are, and just how many things that one person does.
Yeah, and I think it's cool that you've opened up and shared those details with everybody here.
Well, I think the smaller teams are always better, because you know who to blame when something's going. You're not going to be sitting there finger pointing and all over the place.
You end up with fewer committees and more people doing stuff.
Yes, of course.
That is definitely true. And to some extent, I said like we've done probably some of our best work in the last 3 years. I mean, it's like because we've been focusing on the essentials, rather than I got to say, it's a luxury to be able to do that, because I can't really fault any of our previous owners for that. I mean, it's like we all had to make money,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So we've had the luxury, if you may call it that, of being able to say, hey, we're going to take a step back and do things that matter to people. It's like, what are the things that are affecting our users today and giving them a bad experience? Let's correct those before, for example, they're talking about like building a hybrid engine. It's like, what are the first things we need to fix to make people happy and make them work more efficiently?
And without the pressure of, I need to put in X new features in each version so people will pay for an upgrade.
Exactly.
Like, it really frees you.
It's liberating.
Yeah, that's the point I was about to make, was that where the other developers that don't have that benefit of the financial support, where they're having to constantly generate. So how are you going to get your end users to put their hand in their pocket, and so they'll throw a whole stack of new features or some extra content or whatever else, but without fixing the problems that were still being kicked down the road for multiple versions. I mean, and you can fill in any blank there. There's bugs that have been floating around, certain doors for major revisions, and people are going, I don't care less about having some extra loop packs or whatever else, and that's a really cool feature, but why haven't you fixed this from 3 revisions ago? So
but nobody buys. The funny thing is, nobody buys like that. Everybody says they want bug fixes, but when it comes down to the purchasing decision, that doesn't factor in at all.
Yeah, they want the baubles.
Pete knows this better than all of us probably, because Microsoft is a very retail-oriented company too. But the bottom line is like, there's the conflict of pleasing your existing users and acquiring new users, right? Yeah. When new users look at something, forget about free software for a minute. I'm just talking about a product. If you look at product A and a product B, and product B has got more features, and you're a new user, you're going to be, you'll follow the advertising and the marketing, and you'll go for product B because it's got more features.
It's got more stuff. Yeah,
exactly. So I think the challenge is it really has to come from users. It's like users need to look at what really matters. It's like, does it really matter that you have these features, or does it matter that it does something that you actually need?
Yeah. And look, it comes down to horses for courses, because the different DAWs have different strengths and weaknesses. So and that's what that's the beauty of the industry, is that not all of them have to be exactly the same. And thankfully, they're not all exactly the same. So it is good. But I do resonate with the fact that if you take that financial constraint away, everything relaxes a little bit, and you can actually take a breath and go, okay, what is it that we really have to do here without having to push out a new product every 12 months and throw some extra, bits and pieces at it that might break things further down the road without fixing what we should be fixing. So I think that's a good point that Noel has made, that, let's focus on the important stuff. Now, guys, we are we're at the 2 hour plus mark. I think we can put a pin in it today. That has been great. We've covered a whole stack of ground. And, Noel, thank you very much. That's been some great insight, not only in the whole Cakewalk experience that you've had over the years, but also, prior Cakewalk. I mean, that you worked at Kernel, I'm like, oh, wow, really? I mean, that's stuff that I've been in front of, and many, many other people that would not have had any idea. And, the other fact that you're a musician. So you're approaching it from the aspect of being a musician. Not all coders have that dynamic. So you understand that, what you're going to be coding, you actually understand the aspect from the end user and how that actually gets applied. So I think that's really important as well. So that was great. Thank you very, very much to both of you for your time and energy today. If you guys want to kind of do a quick sign off, you're quite welcome to.
Sure. Thanks, Vin, for letting me join here again today. And thank you so much, Noel, for joining the podcast. This has been super cool and informative.
My pleasure, Pete and Vin. I mean, this has been great. Always wonderful to talk shop with all you guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks again. And thank you to the listeners who have made it this far. Okay, on to the next.